The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and baked apples, and the sound of my son's laughter echoed through the house as I turned off the oven timer. Sundays were our sacred ritual. Just the two of us, a tradition I'd held tightly to ever since I adopted Ethan, though he never knew the truth. To him I was his mother, and that was the only truth he needed. I glanced out the window, the December sun casting a pale light over the frosted garden. The memory of his tiny hand clutching mine as a toddler felt both close and distant, like a cherished photograph tucked away in a forgotten album. Ethan was 19 now, tall and broad-shouldered, a quiet strength beneath his easy smile. He had no idea how much of my heart he carried with him. The timer buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. Ethan appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, his sweater slightly crooked. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said, leaning against the frame. "You're just saying that because you're hungry," I teased, pulling the apple pie from the oven. He laughed, that warm, boyish sound that always made me smile. Guilty as charged. It was moments like these that I treasured most, though they also reminded me of the void his presence had filled. My husband, David, had walked out years ago when the doctors confirmed what I already suspected. I couldn't have children. That was the beginning of my unraveling. But where David saw failure, I saw a chance to rebuild, and Ethan had become the thread that stitched my life back together. As we sat down at the table, his phone buzzed. He ignored it, giving me his full attention. "So, any plans for the day?" "Yes. Just working on a project," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe go for a run later." "What about you?" Shrugged. "The usual. Maybe reorganize the attic." "Need help?" I shook my head. "We've got it. You focus on your schoolwork." But the truth was, I wanted the attic to myself. The dusty boxes held memories I wasn't ready to share, secrets I feared would unravel the life we had built. Ethan was my son in every way that mattered, but a part of me always worried what he would feel if he knew the truth. Would he see me differently? Would he feel betrayed? Later that afternoon, I climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, the cold biting at my fingers as I pulled the chain for the light. The familiar scent of aged paper and wood surrounded me, and I began sorting through the boxes. Photos, baby clothes, adoption paperwork, artifacts of a life I'd pieced together with care. I came across a photo of Ethan as a baby, his big blue eyes staring up at the camera. My chest tightened. I had fallen in love with him the moment I saw him, bundled up in the adoption agency's nursery. The social worker had warned me he might be a difficult child, born prematurely to a young mother with no resources and no plans to return. But Ethan had been perfect to me. "Mom!" I startled, nearly dropping the photo. Ethan stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing up here?" "Just going through some old things," I said, setting the photo down. He stepped closer, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Can I help?" "No." The word came out sharper than I intended, and I softened my tone. "I mean, it's just boring stuff. You'd hate it." He didn't move, his gaze drifting to the box beside me. "What's in there?" My heart raced as he reached for it. "Ethan, please." He froze, looking at me with concern. "What's going on?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. How could I explain the weight of my silence? How could I tell him the truth without breaking us both? Instead, I smiled weakly. "It's just old papers. Memories I haven't looked at in years." Ethan studied me for a moment before nodding. "Okay." But as he left, I caught the shadow of doubt in his eyes. That night, as I stood in the doorway of his room, watching him study, I felt the familiar ache of guilt. He deserved to know the truth, but fear kept me rooted in place. I turned away, retreating to my own room, where the photo of baby Ethan sat on my nightstand. I traced the edges of the frame, my mind swirling with memories. I thought of David's departure, the way he had packed his things in silence, leaving behind only an echo of what our marriage had been. I thought of the adoption process, the sleepless nights, the joy of Ethan's first steps. But most of all, I thought of the promise I'd made to myself the day I brought him home, that I would love him unconditionally, no matter what. And so I held on to my secret for now. Ethan was my son, and someday when the time was right I would tell him everything. But tonight I would let myself believe in the simple unspoken bond that tied us together. A bond stronger than blood, built on love and trust. For now that was enough. The days grew shorter as winter settled in, and the world outside seemed muffled by the blanket of snow. Inside our home, a new rhythm had begun to emerge. Ethan and I spent more time together, sharing quiet evenings filled with movies, cooking experiments, and laughter that warmed the space between us. I tried to ignore the way I noticed him now, the set of his jaw when he focused, the way his smile reached his eyes. These were things a mother shouldn't dwell on, yet they lodged themselves in my mind like stubborn thorns. Movie night. Ethan called from the living room one evening. Only if I get to pick, I replied, grabbing a blanket from the hall closet. He groaned dramatically. Fine. But if it's another boring drama, I'm making popcorn as a distraction. I laughed, settling onto the couch as he slumped beside me. You need to expand your horizons. Not everything has to explode to be good. He threw me a teasing look. Explosions make everything better. We fell into a comfortable silence as the movie began, the soft flicker of the screen casting a golden glow on his features. Somewhere between the opening credits and the climax, I felt the weight of his arm settle along the back of the couch. It was casual, familiar. But when his fingers brushed against my shoulder, my heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, a simple absent-minded gesture, but the warmth of his touch lingered, igniting thoughts I couldn't afford to entertain. I shifted slightly, pretending to adjust the blanket, and his arm slipped away. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him glance at me, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "You okay, Mom?" His voice was soft, tentative. I nodded quickly. "Course. Just getting comfortable." He didn't push, but the unspoken tension between us hung in the air like static. When the credits rolled, I feigned a yawn. "Bedtime for me," I said, standing and folding the blanket. "Don't stay up too late." "Night, Mom," he replied, his eyes lingering on me a moment longer than usual. The next day, Ethan surprised me with a rare Saturday morning effort to help around the house. We spent the morning organizing the garage, a task that turned into more laughter than productivity as we unearthed old keepsakes and memories. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up a faded photo of me from my college days. "You were kind of a babe, Mom." I rolled my eyes, snatching the photo from him. "Thanks, I think." He laughed, leaning against the workbench. "Seriously though, it's weird to think of you being my age once. Like you've always just been Mom." I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him then, to explain the truth of how our lives had come together, but the moment felt fragile, and I couldn't bring myself to shatter it. Instead I smiled. Well, believe it or not, I wasn't born a middle-aged lady. I had my wild days. "Oh, now that I have to hear about." "Not a chance," I said, laughing as I swatted at him with the photo. He dodged, grinning. "Fine, keep your secrets." If only he knew. By evening, the garage was somewhat tidier, and I rewarded our efforts with takeout. We sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the heater in the background. Ethan's phone buzzed beside his plate, and he glanced at the screen before silencing it. "Not going to answer?" "Yes." "It's nothing," he said, shrugging. "Just a friend." I studied him for a moment, noting the slight flush in his cheeks. "Girlfriend?" "Tease." He shook his head quickly. "No, nothing like that. I don't really do the whole dating thing." "Oh." I tried to sound casual, but the unexpected relief that washed over me made my stomach twist. "Yeah. It just feels complicated." His gaze flicked to mine, holding it for a beat too long. "Some people are worth it, though." The room felt suddenly smaller, the space between us charged with an unspoken tension. I broke eye contact, reaching for my glass of water. "Well, when you do meet someone, make sure she's good enough for you." "Or he," Ethan said lightly, a teasing note in his voice. I raised an eyebrow, hiding my smile. "Or he." The tension dissolved into laughter, but the moment stayed with me, a quiet thread weaving itself into the fabric of my thoughts. That night, I found myself awake long after Ethan had gone to bed. The house was silent, save for the faint creaks of the old wood settling in the cold. I wandered downstairs, the soft glow of the moon spilling through the windows. Ethan's door was ajar, and I paused, peeking in. He was asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in the dim light. My chest tightened as I watched him, a flood of emotions I couldn't name threatening to overwhelm me. He wasn't my biological son, but he was mine in every way that mattered. Yet, as I stood there, I couldn't deny the shift in our relationship, the way my heart reacted to him now in ways it shouldn't. I turned away quickly, retreating to my room and pressing a hand to my chest. This was wrong. These feelings were wrong. I had spent years building a life for Ethan, protecting him, loving him as my son. But somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred, and I didn't know how to unblur them. The next morning, Ethan caught me staring out the kitchen window, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands. "You okay?" he asked, concern softening his voice. I forced a smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "Life. You. Me." He nodded. "You're growing up so fast, Ethan. It feels like just yesterday I was teaching you how to tie your shoes." He smiled, but there was a tenderness in his expression that made my heart ache. "I wouldn't be who I am without you, Mom." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. I turned away, busying myself with the dishes. "You've always been enough, Ethan," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I was enough, not anymore. The days stretched into weeks, the winter giving way to hints of spring. Ethan's laughter filled the house more often than ever before, and our bond grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. He started seeking me out, not just for casual chats but for company, for comfort. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance during dinner or the way he'd brush against my arm when passing in the kitchen. The warmth of his presence was both a balm and a source of confusion, and I struggled to keep my feelings buried. One quiet evening we sat together on the couch, the glow of a movie flickering on the screen. He leaned closer, his arm brushing mine, and I felt the heat of him, the steady thrum of his breath. I tensed, my heart racing as I stared straight ahead, desperate to focus on anything but the closeness between us. "Mom," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" I nodded too quickly. "Course. Why wouldn't I be? You've seemed different lately," he said, turning to face me. His eyes searched mine, full of concern and something deeper, something I couldn't name. Distant. I tried to smile, but it faltered under his gaze. "I'm fine, Ethan. Really." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, a connection that felt as terrifying as it was comforting. The truth had been weighing on me more heavily with each passing day. The adoption papers hidden in the attic felt like a time bomb, one I knew I couldn't ignore much longer. I loved Ethan more than anything in the world, but I also knew that our closeness, our growing bond, needed clarity before it spiraled into something neither of us could manage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the house in a soft golden light, I found him in the living room. He was sitting by the window, his long legs stretched out in front of him, a book resting in his lap. He looked up when I entered, his face breaking into a smile that always made my chest ache. "Hey," he said, closing the book. "What's up?" I hesitated, my hands trembling as I held onto the back of the chair for support. "Ethan, we need to talk." He frowned, sitting up straighter. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said quickly, though the tightness in my throat betrayed me. "It's just, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." His brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his full attention on me. "'Kay. What is it?" I took a deep breath, the words feeling like stones in my chest. "You're adopted." The silence that followed was deafening. His expression didn't change at first, as though he hadn't fully processed what I'd just said. And then, slowly, his eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly. "Adopted," he repeated, his voice barely audible. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "You've always been my son, Ethan. From the moment I held you, you were mine. But I wasn't the one who gave birth to you." He stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I didn't want you to feel like you weren't enough. I didn't want you to feel separate. You're my son in every way that matters." He looked away, his jaw tight, and my heart shattered at the sight. I moved to sit beside him, reaching for his hand, but he didn't respond. "Ethan," I whispered, "please say something." He turned back to me, and to my surprise, his eyes were wet with unshed tears. "You're the only mom I've ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That hasn't changed." Relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky breath. But then he added, "It does explain some things, though." "What do you mean?" asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, his eyes locking onto mine. "The way I've felt about you lately, it's different." The air between us grew heavy, charged with unspoken truths. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling in my lap. "Ethan, you're my son." "I know," he said quickly, his voice rising. "And I love you. But not just as a son. I don't think I've ever loved you that way. Not completely." "Ethan," I whispered, my voice breaking. "This is wrong," he interrupted, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know. Maybe it is. But I can't help how I feel." My chest tightened, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "And I think you feel it too." I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The truth was too raw, too dangerous to admit. "Ethan, this is complicated." "Complicated doesn't mean it's not real," he said, his voice softening. "Mom, I've never felt this way about anyone. And I don't think I ever will." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I turned back to him, my heart breaking under the weight of his words. "I love you, Ethan. More than you'll ever know. But this." He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. "We'll figure it out. Together." I shook my head, my tears falling freely now. "You're my son," I said again, as if the words could undo the feelings we both shared. "And you're my everything," he whispered. For a long moment we sat there in silence, the world outside fading away. I didn't know what the future held, or how we would navigate the impossible situation we found ourselves in. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw the same love, the same longing, that had been growing between us for weeks. And for the first time I let myself wonder if love, no matter how complicated, could be enough. And as the night stretched on, I stayed by his side, holding his hand, knowing that no matter what, we would face whatever came next together. The days that followed were a delicate dance, each step carefully placed yet charged with emotions that neither of us fully understood. Ethan's demeanor shifted subtly but unmistakably, and I couldn't deny the warmth that his actions brought me. It started with small things. The way he lingered in the kitchen after breakfast, brushing his fingers lightly against mine as he reached for a plate, or the way he held my gaze just a little longer than before. His compliments became more frequent, and though they started innocently enough, about my cooking or the way I kept the house so warm and inviting, there was a new depth to his tone, something that made my cheeks flush. One morning, as I stood by the window sipping my coffee, Ethan came up behind me. I felt his presence before I saw him, the subtle heat of him filling the space between us. "Morning, Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tenderness. "Morning," I replied, my voice catching slightly. "I don't think I've told you how beautiful you look when the light hits you like this," he said, his words so gentle that they felt like a caress. I froze, unsure of how to respond. My heart raced, a mix of flattery and confusion swelling inside me. I turned to face him, searching his expression for some hint of jest, but his eyes were steady, sincere. "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off with a warm smile. "I mean it," he said. "You're stunning, Mom. You always have been." His words stayed with me long after he had left for his morning run. No one had spoken to me like that in years. Not since David had left. It was as if Ethan saw me not just as a mother but as a woman, a person with her own beauty and worth. And though it scared me, it also lit something within me that I hadn't felt in so long, the desire to be seen. That evening he brought home flowers. Lilies, my favorite. I blinked in surprise as he handed them to me. His grin sheepish yet proud. "What's this for?" I asked, holding the bouquet to my chest. "Just because," he said with a shrug, though the warmth in his gaze betrayed the simplicity of his words. I busied myself arranging the flowers in a vase, my hands trembling slightly. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my cheeks burn. "You deserve to be spoiled," he said, his voice low. "You do so much for me, for us. It's time someone did something for you." The words were like honey, sweet and soothing, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "Thank you," I murmured, unable to meet his gaze. "That's very kind of you." "It's not kindness," he replied, stepping closer. "It's the truth." As the days passed, his affection became more tangible. He began helping me with chores I had long since grown used to doing alone. He fixed the squeaky door in the hallway without me asking, took over cleaning the gutters, and insisted on carrying the groceries from the car, even when they were light. His touches grew more frequent too, a kiss on the cheek as he passed me in the kitchen, his hand brushing against mine when we sat together on the couch, or the way his hugs lingered, his arms holding me with a quiet strength that made me feel safe. I couldn't deny the comfort his presence brought me, nor the warmth that spread through my chest when he was near. One afternoon I was sitting on the porch reading, the early spring sun warming the air. Ethan came outside carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed me one and sat beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Reading anything good?" he asked, his voice playful. "Just an old favorite," I replied, holding up the novel. He glanced at the cover and smiled. "You've always loved that one. You remember." "Course. I remember everything about you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I glanced at him, my heart pounding as his eyes met mine. The intensity of his gaze made me feel exposed, as though he could see every thought and feeling I'd tried so hard to hide. "Ethan," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He reached out, taking my hand in his. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just want you to know how much you mean to me. How much I appreciate you." I nodded, unable to speak, and he lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles. The tenderness of the gesture sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickly pulled my hand away, setting the mug down to busy myself. By now, it was undeniable that our relationship had shifted. Ethan's affection went beyond the bounds of a typical mother-son bond, and though I tried to tell myself it was harmless, a part of me knew otherwise. Still, I couldn't bring myself to push him away. His presence filled a void I hadn't even realized was there, and the thought of losing his warmth, his attention, was unbearable. One evening, as I stood at the stove preparing dinner, Ethan came up behind me. He placed his hands gently on my shoulders, his touch firm yet soothing. "Long day?" he asked, his voice close to my ear. "A little," I admitted, my breath hitching as his fingers began to knead the tension in my shoulders. "You do too much," he murmured, his hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. "You should let me take care of you for a change." His words sent a rush of warmth through me, and I closed my eyes, allowing myself to savor the moment. "Ethan, you don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly. "You've done everything for me. You've given me a life, a home, love. It's my turn to give back." I turned to face him, his hands slipping to rest on my arms. His expression was earnest, His eyes filled with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You're my world, Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "And I'll do whatever it takes to make you happy." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him, my emotions a swirling storm of love, fear, and longing. I reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, my hand lingering there longer than it should have. "You've already made me happy," I whispered, my voice breaking. For a moment, the world stood still as we gazed at each other, the air between us thick with unspoken feelings. And then, slowly, he leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. His lips lingered for a heartbeat too long, and when he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, as if waiting for permission. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I knew was that Ethan had become more than just my son. He was my everything,